When people think of World War II tanks, attention usually goes straight to German Panzers or American Shermans. Far less discussed is Japan's armored force, a fleet built under very different assumptions, fighting in very different conditions. Japanese tanks were not designed for sweeping armored duels across Europe. They were shaped by island warfare, limited industry, and a doctrine that prioritized infantry support over brute force. Yet across Asia and the Pacific, these vehicles formed the backbone of Japan's ground campaigns, evolving steadily as the war exposed their strengths and limitations. Understanding Japanese tanks means understanding how strategy, geography, and industrial reality collide under wartime pressure. As we go through this inventory, note where design choices feel deliberate and where they feel constrained. If anything here surprises you, or you think a vehicle deserves more credit, keep that thought in mind. Early interwar and pre-WU light tanks, 1927-1936, Type 89 Igo, Chiro, Otsu variants. The Type 89 Igo was Japan's first domestically produced medium tank and the foundation of its armored doctrine. Introduced in the early 1930s, it was designed primarily for infantry support rather than tank-on-tank combat. Early Chiro versions were gasoline-powered, while the later Otsu variant switched to a diesel engine, a deliberate Japanese choice that reduced fire risk and improved fuel efficiency. Armed with a low-velocity 57mm gun, the Type 89 excelled at destroying field fortifications, but was already underpowered against modern armor by the mid-1930s. Its long service life reflects how slowly Japan's armored doctrine evolved before full-scale war began. Type 94, Tankette. The Type 94 was a small, lightly armored tankette intended for reconnaissance, supply escort, and infantry coordination. Weighing just over 3 tons, it was never meant to engage enemy armor directly. Instead, it filled gaps in Japan's mobility during operations in China, where road networks were poor and resistance was often irregular rather than mechanized. Its thin armor and machine gun armament made it vulnerable, but its mechanical reliability and ease of transport ensured widespread use well into the early war years. The Type 94 highlights Japan's preference for numbers and mobility over protection. Type 97 Tiki, early development context. Developed as an improvement over the Type 94, the Type 97 Tiki introduced better armor layout, a more powerful engine, and in some versions, a 37mm gun. While still classified as a light reconnaissance tank, it represented a shift toward giving even small vehicles limited anti-armor capability. Its compact size allowed deployment in terrain unsuitable for larger tanks, including jungle paths and mountainous regions. However, limited production numbers meant it never fully replaced earlier tankettes. The TK marked the transition from interwar experimentation to wartime necessity. Main light tanks of early mid 1937-1942, Type 95. Heigo. Heigo became the most widely produced and recognizable Japanese tank of World War II. Entering service in 1935 and seeing extensive combat from China to the Pacific Islands, it reflected Japan's emphasis on speed, simplicity, and infantry support. Armed with a 37mm gun and protected by thin riveted armor, the Heigo performed adequately against poorly equipped opponents during the early stages of the war. Its diesel engine provided good range and reliability, an advantage in remote theaters with limited logistics. However, its light armor and high silhouette made it extremely vulnerable once Allied anti-tank weapons became common. Type 97 Chiha, early shortgun variant. The original Type 97 Chiha was Japan's primary medium tank at the outbreak of the Pacific War. Unlike the Hago, it was intended to operate with greater tactical flexibility, supporting infantry while also engaging enemy armor when necessary. Its low-velocity 57mm gun was optimized for high-explosive shells rather than armor penetration, reflecting Japan's continued focus on infantry support. During early campaigns in Malaya and the Philippines, this design choice proved sufficient, but encounters with Soviet tanks at Khalkhin Gol and later Allied armor exposed the Chiha's limitations, forcing Japan to reconsider its firepower priorities. Medium tank evolution and firepower upgrades, 1941-1944. Type 97 Chiha Kai. The Type 97 Chiha Kai was a direct response to battlefield reality. After clashes with Soviet armor in 1939 and increasing encounters with better protected Allied tanks, Japan recognized that its existing guns were no longer sufficient. The Shinhoto variant replaced the original short-barreled 57mm gun with a high-velocity 47mm anti-tank gun mounted in a redesigned turret. This significantly improved armor penetration without increasing vehicle weight. While still lightly armored by international standards, the Chihakai finally gave Japanese crews a realistic chance against early Allied medium tanks, particularly in ambush situations. Type 1. Chihi. Introduced in 1942, the Type 1 Chihi represented Japan's first serious attempt at a modern medium tank. It featured thicker welded armor instead of riveted plates, improving both protection and survivability. The same 47mm gun used on the Chihakai was retained, but with better optics and turret ergonomics. Industrial limitations restricted production numbers, and many Chihi tanks were retained in Japan for homeland defense rather than frontline deployment. Its design shows Japan's growing awareness of modern armored warfare, even as manufacturing capacity lagged behind strategic need. Type 3. Chinu. The Type 3 Chinu was Japan's most capable medium tank to enter limited production during the war. Armed with a long-barreled 75mm gun adapted from field artillery, it could theoretically engage late-war Allied armor on more equal terms. Armor protection was improved, but still modest compared to American and Soviet designs. Like the Chihei, most Chinu tanks never saw combat, instead being reserved for the anticipated defense of the Japanese home islands. The Chinu illustrates how Japanese tank design was finally aligning with global standards, just as the war was being decided elsewhere. Heavy tanks and assault armor concepts, 1935-1944, Type 91, Heavy Tank. The Type 91 Heavy Tank was one of Japan's earliest experiments with breakthrough armor, developed at a time when heavy tanks were still an uncertain concept worldwide. Only weighing significantly more than Japan's light and medium designs, it was intended to lead assaults against fortified positions rather than engage in mobile warfare. Its armor was thicker than contemporary Japanese vehicles, but its low speed and mechanical complexity limited operational usefulness. Produced only in very small numbers, the Type 91 primarily served as a developmental stepping stone rather than a practical battlefield solution. Type 95 Heavy Tank. The Type 95 Heavy Tank was an evolution of the Type 91 concept, designed with slightly improved armor layout and more reliable components. It was conceived to support infantry assaults against entrenched defenses, particularly in continental operations. Despite these improvements, it remained underpowered and slow compared to foreign heavy tanks entering service in the late 1930s. Japanese doctrine increasingly favored lighter, more mobile vehicles, and as a result, the Type 95 never progressed beyond limited production. Its existence highlights Japan's brief exploration of heavy armor before abandoning the concept as impractical. Type 4 Chito. Developmental heavy-medium context. Although often classified closer to a medium tank, the Type 4 Chito represented Japan's late-war attempt to bridge the gap between mobility and protection. Designed with sloped armor and a powerful 75mm gun, it was intended to counter American medium tanks directly. However, shortages of materials, air raids on factories, and shifting strategic priorities prevented full-scale production. Only prototypes were completed before the war ended. The Chito reflects Japan's late recognition that heavier, better-armed tanks were necessary, a realization that came too late to influence the outcome of the war. Amphibious and Special-Purpose Tanks, 1942-1945. Type 2 Kami. The Type 2 Kami was Japan's first purpose-built amphibious tank and one of the most technically distinctive armored vehicles of the war. Developed in cooperation with the Imperial Japanese Navy, it featured large detachable pontoons mounted at the front and rear, allowing it to approach beaches under its own power before shedding the floats and fighting as a conventional light tank. Armed with a 37mm gun and protected by modest armor, the Kami was never intended for armored combat, but for supporting naval landings and securing beachheads. Its design reflected Japan's expectation of offensive amphibious warfare, an assumption that would fade as the strategic situation reversed. Type 3 Kachi. The Type 3 Kachi was a larger and more ambitious amphibious design, intended to operate not only from beaches but also directly from submarines. Heavier than the Kami, it incorporated improved flotation systems, thicker armor, and greater fuel capacity. In theory, this allowed Japanese forces to launch surprise landings on lightly defended islands. In practice, by the time the Kachi entered limited production, Japan was largely on the defensive and lacked the naval dominance required to use it effectively. As a result, very few were completed, and none played a meaningful combat role. Type 5. Tuku. The Type 5. Tuku represented the final evolution of Japan's amphibious tank concept. It was essentially an enlarged Kachi with increased armor protection and an improved turret, reflecting lessons learned from earlier designs. However, industrial collapse and severe material shortages meant the Toku never progressed beyond the prototype stage. Its development underscores how Japanese armored planning continued to prepare for complex amphibious operations, even as strategic reality made such plans increasingly unrealistic. Late war projects and unfielded designs, 1944-1945. Type 4 Chito, production intent. By 1944, the Type 4 Chito had become Japan's most serious attempt to field a competitive medium tank in response to American armor. Unlike earlier Japanese designs, it featured well-sloped welded armor and a high-velocity 75mm gun, comparable in role to Allied medium tank weapons. On paper, the Chito represented a clear generational leap, finally addressing deficiencies in firepower and protection. However, Japan's industrial system was already collapsing under sustained bombing, fuel shortages, and disrupted supply chains. Only a handful of incomplete vehicles were assembled, and none reached operational units before the war ended. Type 5. Chiri. The Type 5. Chiri was intended to be Japan's most advanced tank of the war and a true answer to late-war Allied designs. It was larger, heavier, and more complex than any Japanese tank before it, mounting a long-barreled 75mm gun with an auto-loading mechanism conceptually inspired by foreign designs. Armor protection was improved, and crew ergonomics received unprecedented attention. Yet, the Chiri existed almost entirely on paper and in incomplete prototypes. Material shortages and shifting priorities toward air defense ensured it would never progress beyond experimental status. Experimental super-heavy concepts. In the final stages of the war, Japanese engineers explored super-heavy tank concepts intended for homeland defense, sometimes compared in theory to German heavy projects. These designs envisioned extreme armor thickness and powerful guns positioned to defend key invasion routes. None progressed beyond design studies, and some remain poorly documented. Their importance lies not in battlefield impact, but in illustrating Japan's strategic desperation, a late recognition that existing armor was insufficient to stop an Allied invasion. Japanese tanks of World War II are often dismissed as weak or obsolete, but that judgment misses the context in which they were designed and used. Japan did not build its armored force to fight large-scale tank battles across open plains. Its tanks were shaped by infantry-centric doctrine, difficult terrain, limited industry, and an early belief that speed and coordination mattered more than armor thickness. For much of the 1930s and early 1940s, those assumptions held, especially in China and Southeast Asia. But as the war expanded and Allied firepower increased, Japanese armor struggled to adapt fast enough. Late-war designs like the Chito and Chiri show that Japanese engineers understood what modern tank warfare required. The failure was not technical imagination, but timing, resources, and production capacity. In the end, Japan's WWII tanks tell a broader story: how strategic priorities and industrial limits can shape and ultimately constrain military technology in total war.